My interest peaked at a story in the City Press newspaper, first published also in the Report newspaper at the weekend, about an apparent alcohol and drug problem within professional South African sport. The SA Institute for Drug-Free Sport reporting a number of suspicious increases in test findings for prohibited substances, illegal drugs, and alcohol in South African sports people, but just below the threshold for any positive finding where there could be any censure or real action taken. And the theory is that when players were in a COVID bio bubble, there was uncertainty that we all experience, but uncertainty about the future, about the existential issues. And this all took an emotional toll on many, many players. And that substances were a coping mechanism. But I want to take it a little bit further by asking, are we really shocked? Are we really surprised that even professional sports people are whole human beings? I mean, if a professional rugby season is 11 and a half months long, self-medication is maybe one of those things that could fill a rugby-sized hole to replace meaningful human contact outside of that sport. That article also says that sports bosses are worried. I ask, worried about what? Worried about losing the high-performance edge? Worried about sponsors? Worried that these mainly young men are role models and they have to be perfect in every single part of their lives, even outside of sport? Or should we really be worried about the mental health of sports people, particularly young sports people? And in many of our conversation, we'll focus on particularly young men in sport, with particularly the pressure of money in a hyper-commercial professional sport. It's incredibly easy to talk about, they're rich athletes and it's a privilege for them simply to pay and to get paid for what they are doing. So we thought we'd expand on this. We're going to be speaking to Khalid Galant. He's the CEO of the South African Institute for Drug-Free Sport. Dr. Kirsten van Heerden is a performance psychologist and a former Olympic athlete herself, also speaking to former English rugby international and Leicester Tigers player Tim Stimpson on the line with us from the United Kingdom. Kirsten, Tim, Khalid, thanks so much for joining us. Khalid, I'm going to start with you. Personally, not really shocked or surprised by findings that South African sports people are human as well. They fill emotional holes within their lives, and some of them may turn to substances, illicit or non-illicit. But what are you concerned about?
Thank you, Lester, and for approaching the subject in the public forum. Yes, we are concerned, and it's as you say, a part of the brief that we have as an anti-doping agency is to protect athletes and to protect clean sport. And protecting athletes is about well-being of athletes and the health of athletes. So when we picked up this trend of and non-performance enhancing drug use, specifically related to binge drinking, which is very different from just drinking, and alcohol is not banned in most sports. But we do pick up in terms of our profiles, we can see when binge drinking is happening, and illicit drug use, such as cocaine and marijuana. Marijuana in sport is still banned, but it's a higher threshold level. So we pick up what we call some noise activity, and we were concerned that previously we did not see such a lot of activity in the profiles of athletes around binge drinking and illicit drug use, but post the pandemic, we're starting to see a lot of noise in the profiles around these substances. So we have alerted the sports governing bodies that we are noticing this trend, and they should consider forms of intervention and assistance to the athletes or players.
Khalid, just explain the diagnostic science. How can something be traceable but not traceable enough for there to be a real intervention when it comes to censoring an athlete when there are trace elements of an illicit substance or a illegal substance, but they may be using too much of it, like alcohol?
Well, through our analysis, we can actually see everything, as you refer to as traceable. But different substances have different what we call reporting or threshold levels. So it only becomes an offense beyond a certain level. Some substances are produced naturally by the body, but in artificial amounts. It does have either danger to the athlete's health or a performance-enhancing effect, and that's what we can see in the profile. So that's why there are certain limits, and it's not the same for every substance. So once you go above that limit, or we see that, then it becomes a doping offense.
Kirsten van Heerden, I'm going in according to where you're placed on my screen. Kirsten, when we talk about the pressures of professional sport, the report that was mentioned in the City Press and report particularly mentioned the period around COVID and bio bubbles, and that even professional athletes had a level of existential angst. They were disconnected from their friends and families, uncertain about the future, like we all were. But how does that particular period in our recent history, and also the general pressure of professional sports people, play into not only pressure on the field, but also pressure in their personal lives, and sometimes, and many people do, turn to substances as their coping mechanism, Kirsten?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to talk about this. I think it's an incredibly important topic. And I think that probably the good place to start, as you said, even professional athletes. And I think we have this idea in our head that professional athletes are somehow different to normal people. And we have to separate out this idea of mental toughness and mental health. They sort of overlapping concepts in a sense, but we think, well, you've got this mentally tough, and you speak about rugby often, and but just Olympic athletes, you have a physically kind of tough people. But it doesn't mean that they can't also, as you say, they're also people. And they, with all the same challenges, with all the same difficulties, yet they have to perform on an international stage in front of everyone. So said, we often mix up mental toughness and mental health. And for sure, the COVID period was incredibly difficult for athletes for many different reasons. A lot of them couldn't even train, I was used to swim. You couldn't even get in a swimming pool unless you had one at home, but, so at least you could maybe go for a bit of a run if you were a runner, but it's, it was very hard. And I think what also happened when everything was just locked down, weirdly, people seemed to cope with it slightly better. When things started to open up, the uncertainty that came with it was very difficult. And then, am I going to train? If I train so hard, am I going to compete? What's going to happen? So it was just, it was very hard for everyone. And as you say, athletes are people as well.
With the confidentiality that you have with your clients and patients, but also as a performance psychologist, how many times do professional athletes note to you, I've had to cope and find a way to cope, and sometimes the endorphins from taking a jog is simply not enough. Sometimes I have found myself either a little bit too much at the bottle, or maybe I've needed to relax, and I've consumed recreational substances. Is that a worry for you in a professional capacity?
No, absolutely, it's a concern. And I mean, it's interesting to see the SAID's research that's coming out. I can't give you an exact number, but what I can say is that in my practice, I have seen an increase in many more mental health issues, and certainly more serious mental health issues. Even recently, I was talking to someone, just in the past couple of months, the number of athletes that even with like suicidal ideation and things like that, which is kind of at that extreme end. So whatever impact COVID has had, I think we're still kind of feeling that impact. And definitely athletes are looking at ways to cope. And I think it's wonderful, again, to have conversations like this and, ex-athletes to be able to talk about it, because through those stories, I think it helps break the stigma of mental health that they're able then to access, because that's a problem in sport as well. I say that there's, in the world, with the stigma. And so athletes don't always reach out.
Tim Stimpson, you're a former professional rugby player, played for Leicester Tigers, Newcastle, also for the English and British and Irish Lions. You know the pressure on field. You're part of an organization now called Progressive Rugby, largely lobbying to change the rules of rugby to make it more safer for players. What I'm seeing nowadays is in terms of the high level of competitiveness with athletes, crush tackles, going all in. I just saw 2 weeks ago, there was a brutal clear out which left a Stormers player, Sibelo Sanatla, injured because of the player going in headfirst into a clear out. How important is it for an athlete to always perform 100%, put your body on the line, and how you're hoping to have an impact on that through Progressive Rugby as an organization?
As a professional sportsman, I used to try to get myself in the zone by saying this could be the very last chance I get. And if we're all driven by legacy and we're driven by a wanting to, win the respect of your peers, you're prepared to what we might call discount anything else around you. So that was how I trained 100% and I played 100% because I had that fear of letting my mates down. And so a player will always put his own health and safety last. It's the culture. And so what we're trying to say is Progressive Rugby is, as a governing body, as a family of rugby, we have to protect the player. Because I played with concussion, I played with injuries. It was what you did. It was the Wild West. I'm an old man now. But we've got to, we know more than we did then. And we know that by going, bone on bone for too many hours in training, we know if you play too many games and if you come back too soon, when you've had a knock, we don't want to call it concussion. We want to call it a brain injury. And there's this second hit syndrome. And the evidence says if players come back too soon, they're going to get long-term damage. We're going to get dementia and we're going to get CTE and stuff like that. I've got too many of my friends at the moment are struggling. So just as Progressive Rugby, we know the players are under a massive amount of pressure. It's external pressure from the teammates, but it's mainly internal. You never want to let yourself down. You don't want to go off the field feeling like you could have done another bit. So we have to protect the player from himself.
I have a couple of friends who are rugby journalists, maybe even some rugby friends who are part of a culture of pre-professionalism. You have been playing since the 90s. You made your English debut in 1996. You may have caught maybe the tail end of rugby pre a professional era. And what my friends who have worked and reported and done journalism during that period, particularly covering rugby, is that in a pre-professional era, it was anything goes, whether it was the binge the night before the game to having the beers afterwards, and midweek, we did our thing because we're not professionals and we're still young blokes and we want to have fun. How did the game change, particularly when it comes to a culture of young lads being and doing things that young lads do, and now in the era of professional rugby?
It changed pretty quickly because, I didn't see a gym until I was 19. So it was all on your natural size and natural ability. And we did have Wednesday rugby, Saturday rugby, and you'd have a drink on a Wednesday night and a drink on a Saturday night. And there was that sort of binge, relax mentality around rugby. But then when you wanted to get serious, that's when you start training and getting bigger and faster and stronger. And the whole diet and sacrifice comes in. And one other important factor, when I was playing, we didn't, if we got a bang on the head, we were stood down for 3 weeks. But what's been bizarre for me is that without any medical evidence, that return to play protocol has become 6 days. And as the players get stronger, as the hits get bigger, more intense, because they're all fitter, faster, stronger than I ever was, why are they the brains haven't changed, have they? So I really want the governing bodies to err on the side of caution to protect the players. They keep saying they're waiting for evidence. But we know there's evidence that if you keep banging your head too many times, it's going to get damaged. So, yeah, I think the game's become very brutal. I think some of the law changes have meant that there's more, bone on bone, that's tackling at the gain line. The things have happened that have devalued, true scrummaging and true mauling. And I think with more players fitter, faster, stronger, you tend to get far more, head knocks. Then you used to have a side-on tackle as well, because it used to be, they get the ball into the outside channel, gas the 13, and you go in the corner. It was quite a simple and a nice game to watch.
Kirsten, is particularly in a rugby context, do you have clients who say, I need to get selected. I need to get a sighting with selectors for the franchise or even the Springboks? I need to throw in the big tackles. I need to clear out as quickly and as hard as possible, but at the same time worried about, a skew neck into a clear out means I could suffer serious neck or head injury. Is that consciousness, particularly of a young man in professional rugby, aware of how a career could be destroyed in literally a moment of a tackle? Is that discussion that players have with you around their future?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's kind of what we were talking about. You have to protect players from themselves because they would be willing to put their bodies on the line. And so it's not necessarily, I think, something that's front of mind all the time that I can get very hurt, because I think if it was, you probably wouldn't necessarily go in for the very hard tackles. But there certainly are some players, I've had players before that are aware of it. And you spoke about some of the pressures earlier. I'll never forget one client was, the idea was, if I get a career-ending injury, my family have no money. Like, this is my one shot at being able to kind of make it. So there's various different pressures for different athletes. But again, that idea of, but I need to go and actually perform and get and do what I need to do to get to the top. And as you say, unless we protect players from themselves, the nature of the athlete personality generally is I just do more and more and more and more.
Carly, let's talk about an era of locker room culture. This era, this concept of before professional era, it was a drink before the game, we'll sweat it out during the day, and there's a celebratory or commiseration drink afterwards. You say that hasn't necessarily changed in many of our sports codes, that a binge consumption culture still exists in many of our national sports, Khalid?
Yes, that's what we picked up. And, as Tim mentioned, those were the traditions, of sport in a previous era, and it is, tended to continue. And we tend to, the entourage or people responsible for protecting the athletes or servicing the team tends to turn a blind eye into the seriousness of these things. And we have to differentiate between drinking, a celebratory drink, and binge drinking. Those are completely different things, and their impact on the body
is the binge drinking happening in South African sport as part of a systemic issue and not just...
Well, I won't go so far as to say systemic, because we haven't done research on it, but we have, as I've mentioned, picked up on those trends. But again, it's about the I like the word that you use, hyper commercial world, and sport is no different. I mean, it just goes lower down now in terms of a high school level. A kid is in matric and he's facing pressures of, can I get a contract to a franchise? Can I get a contract to a URC team in Europe or something like that? So the pressures have just come down in terms of not only at the elite level or Springbok level or Protea level, but down to the high school level. So there's definitely a very different and increased level of pressure on athletes from a young to a senior level.
We're continuing our conversation with Khalid Galant, Tim Stimpson, as well as Kirsten van Heerden. It follows a report in weekend papers around a worry, a concern, and alarm bells of substance use within professional South African sport. But we're talking about what drives professional athletes to binge, to engage in recreational use. I largely posit that they are human as well. They fill voids within their own lives as well. Of course, there is the worry about impact on performance, but also the level of under what scrutiny they are under. Kirsten, let's talk quickly about, are young athletes prepared? Are they taken through a process that says, in an era of social media where everyone has a camera phone, whether you're going to be walking out of a restaurant at 6 o'clock in the evening, or whether you're walking out of a club at 3 o'clock of the morning, there may be a picture snapped of you inside, outside the club, whatever you do is going to come under scrutiny. And more importantly, you are now a role model. Is that firstly fair to expect of an 18-year-old who may not even finish high school, but has now become a professional sports star? Are they prepared?
Yeah, I don't think it's fair necessarily, but it kind of is what it is. And so that's what we have to help them manage. And some are prepared and some are not. And I think that there are organizations like in South Africa, My Players, which is the Rugby Players Union, SACA, which is the African Cricketers Association, they're doing some work to try and help this kind of transition. But it really is one of my areas of interest, these different transitions, career athletes' lives, because if you look at a lot of the Olympic sporting codes, there's not that. So at least in the more professional sports, for want of a better word, they do have player development managers that try and help manage some of this. But as I said, if you look at track and field running, something, we don't have that. And it's a huge issue because we sell this dream to athletes, when they're at high school very often, but there's so much more to it. It's not just what you see on TV, as we know, it's not the glitz and glamour. And
but you're a millionaire
you're
a millionaire before you're 25, yeah. Kirsten. You should be able to sop up all that pressure. And you don't need to find any distraction, because your distraction should be the field, because that's what we pay our ticket money and our TV subscriptions, so that you can live the life of a multi-millionaire and enjoy the sport that you love.
No, and you're right. And this is the problem with people say, well, what do you have to be sad about? Or what do you have to be anxious about? Because you've got all this money. And as you can, and I agree, they're human. And to be fair, how many of us at 18 made very smart decisions? And certainly if we had millions of rands, we'd be able to know what to do with it. So we have to keep that in mind. But it speaks to your point that there's certainly more work needs to be done in helping athletes transition into this space.
Tim, with regards to responsible rugby and how it affects player longevity in the game, a question from a listener here. Rugby players have from a young age are getting abnormally large. Please focus on performance enhancing drugs. How does PED, performance enhancing substances, tie into the conversation about amending rules to make the game of rugby safer, particularly at the point of contact, the point of collision, in what rugby has become? Not a contact sport, but a collision sport.
Right. So when I was playing, nobody was taking anabolic steroids in my era, but we started to eat properly and sleep properly and train properly. So we got much, much bigger. So I don't think there's a massive problem in steroid abuse in my game in rugby. I don't know what it's like in South Africa, but hopefully it's not the same. Going back to binge drinking and alcohol and that sort of thing, I mean, are we talking about the one or two people that are the winners? Because in every race and every competition, you've got about 95 other people that are coping with defeat. So I'd be saying that it's really important that we teach every athlete that you do your best, and that's success in itself. And we've got to look at who's drinking and why they're drinking. And if in COVID you said there was a massive spike, it's because all of a sudden you've lost that ability to express yourself. And you've lost that sense of identity and ability to impact the world around you, and you're lost. And so it's really about education, isn't it? It's really about empowering the athlete to know that it's okay to be your best, but it's not okay to damage yourself. And that's the idea of progressive rugby. Like we're saying, we're protecting the athlete from themselves, and the governing bodies have got to start putting in rest periods. They've got to start implementing the laws properly in rugby to reduce the chances of people getting these life-changing injuries. So, it's sport is a wonderful thing. It's given me the confidence to take on adversity and deal with, all sorts of setbacks, selections, injuries, life. You lose people, don't you? But you got to learn how to bounce. But we talk about transition there, Kirsten. I mean, what about the transition at the end of the career? I mean, you've conditioned the sports person to be a machine, to sacrifice and to give everything for his mates. And all of a sudden, it's a bit like when you come out of the military. Where have all your mates gone? Where's your sense of purpose gone? Where's your value gone? And no one's teaching us how to, change back to being a normal human being. So I found that I've been about 15 years through rugby, and I'm just waking up now to say I'm still fighting. I'm still firefighting. I'm still taking on that collision. I'm still smashing the bloke in front of me. And we've got to learn how to just be a bit calmer and drink coffees and accept that we're not perfect. And we sometimes need a cuddle.
Khalid, I'll let you have the last word. Let's talk just quickly about that listener question of performance-enhancing substances. You are the CEO of the South African Institute for Drug-Free Sport. And then a second part of that, this two-part question is, have South African sports federations responded positively to your report that says there is a growing concern of excessive substance use within professional sport?
Yeah, I'll respond to the PED, the performance enhancing drugs, the safety aspects, particularly at junior sport. And when we have actually been asked by headmasters at school, please come test some of these kids that we play against, or come talk to the schools. There's a safety aspect. If years ago when I played rugby, we played in weight categories. Now it's slightly different. So all of us were under 55 kilograms. So I would never tackle someone 65 kilograms. And nowadays it's slightly different. The bigger the athlete, and as Tim mentioned, whether it's contact sport or impact rugby, there is a safety aspect in terms of that collision. So yes, performance enhancing drugs does have a safety aspect in terms of the actual sport with respect to contact in the game. With respect to the national sports authorities and the response to the advisory letters that we've sent to them with respect to illicit drugs, they've all responded very positively. And, you know, as Tim mentioned, the discussion was around education. And I've advised them that testing is not the panacea here. It's about education. It's about informing on decision making and what the options are, and letting players know not everyone has the true interest in mind. Again, coming back to that hyper commercialism of sport, people have different interests for young athletes to excel or athletes to compete.
Fortunately, that's all we have time for. But Khalid Galant, Tim Stimpson, Kirsten van Heerden, really appreciate your conversation, and thank you for talking to us here on Good Morning Cape Town.